Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary here in New York City. Thank you for joining us for another in our series of Just Conversations, where we engage issues of racialized inequality, inequities intrinsic to our nation, and our collective responsibility to create a more just future. This fall, our Just Conversations are focusing on the issues raised by the New York Times essays known as the 1619 Project. Today, I am so very pleased and excited to welcome to this conversation cultural critic, activist, co-founder of the Crunk Feminist Collection, Dr. Brittney Cooper. Dr. Cooper is currently Associate Professor in the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Rutgers University, author of numerous articles, essays, and books, including Beyond Respectability, The Intellectual Thought of Race Women, Eloquent Rage, A Black Feminist Discovers Her Superpower, as well as co-editor of the Crunk Feminist Collection. And I might add on a personal note, when I need a little, as she would call it, homegirl intervention or insight, I frequently turn to the words and writings of Brittney Cooper. And so I am more than happy that I get an opportunity to work with Dr. Cooper on the Aspen Institute's Task Force on Racial and Religious Justice, where we're both members, but I am more than excited to have her joining me today. Thank you, Dr. Brittney Cooper, for joining me in this conversation this afternoon.
Thank you, Dr. Douglas. It's such a pleasure.
So let me jump right in. What a time, as our grandparents might say, that we find ourselves in this COVID pandemic reality and more. So I want to start there. You said in a blog that you wrote during the first Holy Week and Easter season in the COVID pandemic, that when we were all asked to mask, you said that putting on our mask is unmasking so much about who we are as a country and as a body politic. I have a two-part question, perhaps one question asked in two ways. First part is this: what did COVID unmask about our country?
Yeah, I think it masked an unhealthy descent into individualism, a deep selfishness and lack of empathy that borders on narcissism. We have built increasingly societies where people are atomized and individualistic, and so they are not in community with folks, and so there's a way in which we don't feel a collective responsibility to each other. And so I watched as the public health messaging said, don't just put a mask on for yourself, put a mask on for your neighbor. And every time it was said, I thought, like, that is not resonating. It's not working as a message, because in the end, people really only think about themselves and they see other people as enemies to themselves. And even when I thought about my own heart, I was like, what's interesting is I am also intensely self-protective. And so I thought, how can I be safe? My second thought was always how to make others safe. And so I want to be honest about that I didn't sort of come into masking from an altruistic point of view, but even the inability to do the work, to take the second step, to learn that the world is not just about oneself, I think is huge. And I also think that we learned that we're living in a time and in a community where people, where all communities of folks, not just white folks, not just conservatives, people on the right, are susceptible to disinformation and misinformation.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Watching Black communities really struggle to make sense of the, admittedly muddled public health messaging around COVID, watching the way that we adopted conspiracy theories, watching the way that we too say things like, I'm doing my research, and then refusing to take good safety precautions. I said, well, this doesn't sound very different to me than the folks that I know get all their news from Fox News. And so how do we make sense of that as a community? How do we tell each other the truth when there seems to be real deep distrust, not only of medical institutions, but governmental institutions? That is founded, but it has constrained our ability in this moment to tell the truths we need to tell to stay alive. And I find that is urgent to me, and it is at crisis level.
No, I agree. And the irony is that it always ends up disproportionately impacting people of color in the community. And I'm really at a loss sometimes when I hear the way in which the Black community, some segments of the Black community have so bought into some of these conspiracy theories initially, sort of on this historical foundation of mistrust that has been built over a long time. And now, using that, and it's as if that's now used against us, and we're still being killed because we won't take the medicine. First, we were killed because they were giving us the medicine. And now we're being killed because we won't take the medicine. And I just don't know. What we're talking about is the confounding nature of white supremacy, right? How do we get out of that, Brittney, to the truth?
Yeah, look, I think that the harder part is recognizing, I do a whole unit in my classes now on disinformation. And the reality is that, knowledge is social. None of us has the capacity to know everything there is to know. And so we have people that we trust to tell us the truth. And the challenge is that disinformation moves at a very fast speed and trust moves at a very slow speed. And on top, you know what I mean? And so what you need is these sort of relationships where you can get in there with people and folks that you trust can kind of compel you. But we don't live in a world that is able to facilitate that trust. We also don't have, we've seen an erosion of institutions like the church, right? Which were these communities of trust and faith that even if there were schisms and contention, that, a person could stand, the pastor, your deacon, your Sunday school teacher, and come together and say, here is what we need to do for the health of the community. But the consequence of folks being disconnected, even from faith communities in our community, is that there's no central location to get information out and to be able to sit and to think and reason together about what is the best set of approaches. And so I think we are in a massive disinformation crisis. And I think that is compounded by the fact that because Black people have been so abused by misinformation and authoritative knowledge systems in the past, we have a legitimate reason to be, to have healthy skepticism. And I ask myself over and over again, what would like a Black feminist framework say to this? Because we are the ones that say, trust your own knowledge, trust your spirit. It's not just the empirical. But a friend said to me, yes, but what we never said was don't trust good sense though. Like good sense is at the heart of the Black feminist project. And sometimes our people, I think, are trying to be so woke and so, resistant to governmental top-down intervention that they're also letting it impede what good sense would say.
As my grandmother used to say, use the common sense you were born with. And I always think there's a fine line, right, between Black health and what I like to say, and Black paranoia. And we have to find that line. I want to follow this unmasking metaphor. I went a little further, and that at the same time, we now find ourselves, which I again think is no accident, in this moment of people in this fight against critical race theory, which we all know the people who are against it don't know what it's about. And what's really at stake, it seems to me, is that there is this fear of a different gaze upon the nation's history. What is it that you believe they are afraid will be unmasked if we indeed talk about our history in a different way?
I mean, here's the thing. I think that the reality is that there is no moral or political legitimacy at all to the white supremacist project that we have been subjected to. That's it, right? That's the core of it, that here you have people who live on stolen land, who stole people to work those lands, who have for the better part of 4 centuries exploited those people and decimated them through political decisions that continue to be about white dominance. Raising a generation of children who know that and who then come home and around the dinner table say, well, should we celebrate Thanksgiving? Right? Well, why is Jesus white? Right? Who begin to ask all of these fundamental questions that scares, I think, these parents who have grown up with a version of the world in which, and I think about this a lot because I grew up in the 90s. And in the 90s, we had this narrative of ourselves as a country that was moving towards the integration project, that was liberal, that was, completing the great 20th century, right? And I have watched the kids that I know as a child would have said my grandparents' racism was racist and wrong become rampant, rabid Trump supporters.
Right.
And I spend a lot of time trying to think about what that is. And I'm like, oh, but there were two possibilities. One was that they could get on board with a progress that was more multiracial. The other was that they could, tether themselves to their white supremacist roots. And faced with the presidency of Barack Obama, I think they recognized how unready they were. And now they have made us all pay for it for the last decade,
Yeah, and we know in history that anytime Black people have made any measure of progress, white supremacy hangs on even more tightly. I like to say stands its ground. And so in many respects, we're seeing that. The interesting thing, and you talked about the children, white parents going into these school boards and saying they don't want their white children to feel bad about being white. And what strikes me is that for decades, and longer, Black children have had to sit in classrooms listening to this history as well as other children of color, and no one cared that they were made to feel bad. And that planet within them, right, as Audre Lorde would say, is that piece of the oppressor inside of them. Brittney, how in this time when whiteness has become truth, how in this time are we ever to begin to extract that piece of the oppressor that is deeply rooted inside of us, even as people of color? Even at age 64, I'm still trying to extract, because I sat in them classroom spaces, right? And our children still do. So what do we do when that no one cares about our children?
Yeah. I think about this a lot. I was very angry last week and did a few TV segments about how Condoleezza Rice had said that we shouldn't make white children feel bad. And what do you do when you have a Black woman who survived who survived in Birmingham, who lived through the Birmingham church bombing, becoming a voice for those who don't want to tell the truth about the historical forces that led to that very kind of tragedy, right? But in the end, I think that the only thing that I think we can say is that we continue to fight like hell. We continue to struggle. We continue to tell the truth, as we would say in the church, in season and out of season, right? In part because, one of the things I said too in response to Condoleezza was, why do we think that we don't have to teach white children to be anti-racist when Black children are experiencing racism?
Right.
And they're not just experiencing racism at the hands of structures and school systems and adults. White children are coming to school and actively being racist, right? And so I tell my own stories about the racism that white children committed against me in schools as an 8-year-old and an 11-year-old, and how things haven't changed that much in that regard. And so if Black children are old enough to experience racism, then white children are old enough to learn about it. And that has to be our stance. The other thing is, we have built a whole society in which we value white feelings over Black facts. Yeah. I just will keep on saying this,
Like where you talk about white women's tears. Yes.
Come on. That's right. And so the thing is, white people's feeling that they are losing power is the basis for January 6th, Donald Trump, this Republican backlash. And the thing is, it's only a feeling. By no metric that we can look at are they losing power, other than that they are decreasing in population. But they are not decreasing in economic strength. They are not decreasing in political strength. They are not decreasing in ideological strength. And so they simply have the feeling that they are, and they then order the universe based upon how they feel. And then they resent those of us who say that's actually not true. And what becomes even then more concerning is these people know they're not telling the truth. The leaders among them absolutely know it's not the truth, right? But what they have told us, these evangelical Christians, is that truth is not a category that matters. And in that way, that was the thing that inspired my Holy Week reflection, because I'm always arrested by this moment when Pilate says, as they're trying to hand over Jesus, well, what is truth?
Right.
And I'm like, well, at the point that you decide that truth is not a salient category, then you can do anything you want to do, right? And that is what they have done. So
what, we are at this place where truth doesn't matter.
Yeah.
At least anything other than white truth. And those two things go together to me. Whiteness and truth.
They do not. They
do not.
They do not.
That's right. So who do we turn to? What then becomes the role and
Right.
of the faith community? You
Yeah.
know, who to provide the moral leadership, and what happens when the faith community, you talking about the faith community, and when they have been co-opted by the whiteness that is the truth that is whiteness? Who's gonna? Where do
I
we
mean,
turn? What's the role of
look, that is why. So here's the thing, Dr. Douglas, I got to read your book as a graduate student, and that's when I was exposed to these rich traditions of womanist theology. And the thing that I thought about is like, what would have happened if I'd had this material as a young person, right? What would happen if I'd grown up hearing preachers and going to church services with folk who knew this kind of information? Because what bothers me is, here's the thing about church. Church is the one place that Black people go to consistently where we are able to express our feelings and say everything is not right, to cry and be held, to have someone affirm that our souls matter, that we are valuable to the divine, right? And then to actually take a text together and grapple with its meaning. Where else do you do that if you don't go to college? There's literally nowhere else that you get to do that. And so we should see that kind of gathering as precious for who we want to be as a community. And then, so that is why then preachers make me very mad when they don't then give people better frameworks to understand experience. And so, so I think that what we have to do is continue to encourage new generations of church leaders and even our elders. I would love it if our elders said more. My dad, one time, my dad helps me. We don't always agree theologically, but one thing he will do, he taught more recently in the last 5 years or so, a more expansive sermon about communion. And he said, look, people, you're welcome at the table. Even if you don't feel worthy, you're welcome. And he was like, I didn't always think that way. And he just stood up one day and he said, but I preached it wrong. I preached it wrong. What if our elders said, you know what? My understanding has shifted and I preached it wrong. And then what would happen if young people weren't trying? Look, here's the other thing. I'm reading Dante Stewart's book, Shouting in the Fire, right now.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's majestic and it's helping me. But also, we had a generation of young people, and I barely escaped this. I was on the front end of it, who have come to believe that white evangelicalism is the proper way to do Christianity. Because Black churches, shorn of the political critique of the 60s and 70s, put themselves in. I think that basically Black ministers looked at what white folks were doing and said, well, they doing so well with how they preach Jesus that maybe our people could do better if we preach Jesus that way, missing the point that they preached a Jesus that allowed them to exploit us and do better at our expense.
Well, but that's exactly right. It is that. All I can say to that is amen. It is that evangelical white Protestant Puritanism that has allowed for this sacred canopy that has enslaved Black people, that has in fact continues to legitimate our oppression. And somehow what I'm saying is that the Black church, and this isn't the first time that it has happened, has seeded the ground, right? Well, Gayrod Wilmore once said that we've become de-radicalized. We've lost our roots, and we've begun to imitate the white church, even when we talk about the way in which it treated blues women, et cetera. And I want to, that's going to be
that's good.
But what's interesting, Brittney, when you talk about this, is my own son said to me, you brought up the Black Christ, and it's the basis for which my forthcoming book. He said, okay, I get it that Christ is Black, but what good is that doing us now? And so what good is that?
Well, here's the thing, right? A lot of this is about what is the basis by which we can continue to ally ourselves with the Christian project for those of us who do, because and that is the reckoning that I'm with, right? It's like, well, I grew up believing a set of things about what it meant to be a Christian, and now I understand a different set of things about how, well, here Jesus was challenging empire, and here Jesus was saying, I stand with the least of these. And here's the thing that I actually say to my students a lot, right? And it irritates them because I have all of these grad students in gender studies, and they are like, we don't do organized religion, And I say, okay. But here's the thing. You want to have a revolution, which is something that people have. You want people to risk everything that matters to them for a revolution they've never seen. And I was like, the other word for that is faith. To ask people to to risk everything for a world that does not yet exist. I said the only other people I know who say things like that regularly are church folks, right? Who say the world is broken and we can believe and then act in our belief in a way that leads us to something else. And so when folks come to understand that the revolutions they want are fundamentally faith propositions, then they might be able to understand they ain't got to get on board with all of the tenets of Christianity, but they do then have to get on board with the idea that people got to be disciplined into the process of what it means to believe in something that does not yet exist. That requires belief, not skepticism, not cynicism, not nihilism, right? None of those things. Belief is a continual practice every day. And so if Black people come to understand that we get to have gods in our own image too, right? That matters in terms of our ability to get on board with faith projects that actually perhaps like can bring about a new world, you know.
Well, yes. and I think of, and people have heard me say this before, and this will get me, like our time is going, so I'm going to rush through these next questions. But I think often, and I often say of the Black women, and I think of my great-grandmother who was born in slavery, who was Black women who were born in slavery, died in slavery, never breathed a free breath, never ever dreamt that they would breathe a free breath. That's but right. They fought for freedom anyhow because they believed in the freedom that was the justice of God, right? So they knew that it was going to happen. And because they did that, that's why you and I can be sitting
here. That's right. That's
talking. Right. So it leads me to this, what if we changed our gaze and we didn't simply talk about the binaries, changing from a white gaze to a Black gaze, but we changed our gaze and we talked about the people who sit at the intersection of a white heterosexist, patriarchal supremacist project. Yeah. What would that gaze look like? What would it tell us about history if we did it from the vantage point of Black women?
Yes. I mean, you know, now you're walking down Anna Julia Cooper lane to me, you know what I mean? And look, Anna Julia Cooper, look, I reflect on that sister a lot because, you know, and so for me, she helps me in a couple of ways. One of the things is I think that Black women have always been obsessed in their work, whether they were talking about religion or not, with what it means to live out things incarnationally, right? Yeah. Which is to say that, you know, in Black women's work, so in my first book, I call this Embodied Discourse, but really I'm just riffing on a notion of the incarnation. I don't say it explicitly, but I'm really talking about the idea that we think that our job is to embody the best set of ideas about who we are. We really do sort of sit in that thing about the word is made flesh, right? And so that's why we think that the words, the concepts, the discourse, the histories that our kids learn determine what worlds are possible for them, right? Determine what this Blackness ultimately gets to mean. I think that, and look, that's a Black woman's thing. It's like, I had a kid ask me the other day, well, when you see Du Bois and he says, I'm two-ness, my soul, two warring bodies in one, in one dark soul, that thing, right? And I said, well, Black women don't, in that same period, don't talk about it that way. Black women don't talk about the two-ness as a thing that rips them apart. You have Cooper saying, oh, it gives me a special vantage point. That's why other people can't see as well as I can, right? And I think that's the gendered piece, right? Men see that as an existential struggle. Black women see it as an existential gift. And I think that's where I would start.
Oh, I like that. It's not an existential struggle, it's an existential gift. But sometimes that gift puts us in these positions where we are, as Patricia Hill Collins said, Black women always, it seems our life is about being the outsider within. Yeah. You and I are certainly in the academy space, the outsiders within, and finding ourselves having to lead across differences, being leaders across differences, even through our daggone rage. So Brittney, how do you lead and be a leader across differences? And I'm talking, with our white sisters, and all those other realities through the rage. And that's where we always find.
Yeah. I've been trying to think a lot about leadership, and part of these days, because I don't know how much I see myself as a leader in the traditional sense, but in part because I lack patience with foolishness, and it tends to create a problem. But I think that one is always the sort of humility that says we all have our work to do, right? And what I always want is the ability to sort of see. I don't ever want to lose, because of racism or sexism, the ability to connect with people at the level of shared interest or shared possibility, right? And I think that and more to the point, what I often say to young people is, it's not just enough to say the right things. It's not just enough to think the right things or to be able to outline a set of woke politics and use all of the right language. What do you do when you have to live that out in the messiness of people with community? And what do you do when does your leadership make space for people to be in process, to earnestly be in process, not to be using process as a delay so they can continue to be raggedy and violent? But when folks are really willing to meet you at the table, are you prepared to journey with people in some way through that work? And so to me, that is what it means to lead across difference. Is I'm a firm believer that if I both give the folks in my orbit tools that are useful, that I have found useful, but also if I am willing to be vulnerable about the places that I don't have it figured out yet, and I don't go in performing like I understand all of this stuff, or I live out my feminist, radical, progressive, Christian, whatever revolution well every single day, then that gives other people the space to say, I'm still struggling with this, or this doesn't make sense to me, or are we sure XYZ thing? That's a realer, more authentic revolution than saying all of the right stuff and then wondering why things fall apart. And it's because things fall apart because if you don't do the work of messiness around revolution, then you'll start to think that revolutions are only for the people who think like you and that you like.
Yeah, no, I love that. And it's messy work, right? Then I just always say, you know what, just at least if you're on the arc that bends toward justice and you with integrity that you want to be there, then I can take the messiness and all of that. But it's when the process is an excuse not to.
Yeah. And here's the thing. But I also think that our spirits tell us that, though, right? I think we know when folks are saying the right things, but they really aren't committed. But I think that the other thing, and another friend and I always talk about this, but sometimes we harder on the people that are showing up and trying than the folks who don't. And that's the thing I mean. And look, and I say that with the clear caveat that I know in particular in Black communities that is often used as a cloak to be harmful to trans folks and queer folks. And I want to be real clear that I'm not here for that. And that ain't what I'm talking about, right? You ain't got to understand how people show up. And here's the thing, if you listen, it ain't so hard to understand. So there's that, right? Listen and lead from empathy, and then you can understand. But also, you can just call people who they are. You can just affirm that folks get to show up and live their lives without, because you can do that without a full understanding. So I'm not talking about that, but I'm saying that we also have one of the things we have is a generation of young folks who have really sophisticated political language, critiques, and they're very impressive. But then when you get up close, you be like, well, why does this look so messy and messed up? And why is it all falling apart? And it's like, because what they don't necessarily have is the requisite emotional intelligence to go with all of those politics. And in the end, revolutions are people, politics are people, churches are people, governments are people. And if you can't deal with people, then your revolution is not a thing worth investing in. That's what I mean.
Every time you say that, you remind me of the Black poets who said the revolution won't be televised.
Come on. That's what I mean. Yeah.
And now I'm dating myself, but I'm going to get you out on the last question, but also to say to you that, one of the things that it seems to me before I will get into any kind of work with someone is that there has to be a shared agreement on everybody's common sacred humanity. I don't care how they show up, that everyone that has breath or has ever had breath is sacred because their breath is sacred. And so if we can't get on that accord, then we can't be in the justice work together because it's not justice work. So it leads me to last question. I'm gonna get you out of here.
Yeah.
So with all of this said and done, and first it means we're gonna have to keep talking, but what, Brittney, in your imagination, does a just society look like?
Ooh, I mean, if I knew that, well, you know, um, I mean, here's the thing. I think we've made this more complicated than it has to be. I think Black women's ethic and ethos, everybody has enough food to eat. Everybody has, excuse me. I'm sorry. Look, let me finish. I'm sorry. Zooming in a pandemic. But here's the thing. Everyone has enough food to eat. Everyone has the education. Everyone has the space to learn, to grow, to ask questions. We lead from a question about what does safety look like for the least of these, for young people, for children, for folks with disabilities, for the poor, right? We don't accept the idea that we have to have a world in which poor people are permanent. But we build a world in which sufficiency is our standard, right? And we also think, we got to think too about notions of accessibility. All of us will not always be in these, able-bodied bodies, able to do everything. If you have elders in your life, they will just say, baby, wait on time. Things will change. But we can build a world where, whatever people's ability is in terms of bodily capacity and mental and emotional capacity, that we honor that and that we seek to do no harm, right? And so that's what I hope, that we begin to think in notions of safety. We begin to think in notions of doing no harm. We begin to think in notions of sufficiency and care. And quite frankly, I think we also going to have to let go of our investment in capitalist productivity and performativity.
Yes.
We are not what we produce. I heard a minister say many, many, many years ago at this point, the minister is more important than a ministry. The person is more important than what they produce. And we don't actually believe, because here's the thing. How do you reconcile that when we also say, well, I want to be part of something bigger than myself? I always think that thinking actually gets us in a hard place, because it feels true, except for that then we often then continue to sacrifice ourselves because we want to be part of something bigger than ourselves. And that thinking leads us to a place where we don't then have a proper valuation of ourselves. And Black women suffer the most in that sort of thinking. We martyr ourselves. We and we say, well, no, the work is bigger than me, and this is not just about me, but you matter too. And so what does it mean to commit to a life of work that you say matters so much more than you, that in the end you feel demoralized because you don't know where you matter in the work that you came to do?
No,
we got to ask that question.
That's a perfect way to end, and that's right. Then that's how we get this language of being an essential worker, but that essential worker is not considered an essential human being.
Come on.
Essential workers, first and foremost, essential human beings.
That's right.
Dr. Brittney Cooper, thank you so much, not simply for this conversation, but for the work that you do, and for the homegirl intervention that you give all of us all the time.